Today I'm going to discuss how they dehydrated food back in the old days, and all of these photographs are from books which were printed before 1923, so I believe they are free of any copyright restrictions, and they are being used for educational purposes only. Whenever you hear about people dehydrating in the old days, you often hear that they dried the food out in the sun. Well, that was only partially true. It was done that way on a commercial basis, where they had the climate for it and the manpower. But when it came to people doing it at home, they often didn't have the necessary sunshine or the time for it. According to these books, it took about 5 days to dehydrate food in the sun. In order to dry food in the sun, you need to do several things. You need to keep the food protected from insects and dust, and you have to bring the food in before dusk every night so that it won't be hit by the dew. There are also a couple of moths that are a real problem when you're dehydrating food outdoors. One is called an Indian meal moth, which is about 3/8 of an inch long, and it's gray and copper brown in color. And they said that if that moth laid eggs on the food, then they would hatch within 10 days, and a new generation would come about every couple of months, and they would just destroy all of your food. So they really didn't like to dehydrate food outdoors because the insects could be a real problem. And there was another moth called a fake moth that was about the same size and appearance, but it was a darker gray. And they both flew at night about dusk, so that's one of the reasons why you need to get the food in if you do dry your food outdoors. And they would, one book said that the food should be covered well with cheesecloth, that mosquito netting wasn't sufficient. The holes were too big, that those moths could get through it. And it was better if you could cover the food with glass. And here is a dehydrator that was used outdoors that is made from a window. The top part is a window, and then it has the trays for dehydrating the food underneath. And they would often line the bottoms of the trays with either muslin or a wire mesh. And book said that if you use wire mesh to cover it with muslin or paper to keep the food away from the metal, that it could react to the metal. They also said that any food dehydrated outside should be heated in an oven for at least 10 minutes at 150 degrees in order to kill any insect eggs. Here's another method for drying outdoors. The one on the top, they're just boxes that are covered with glass. They also said that the food needed to be turned over occasionally. Here's another method they would use. They're little frames they would build and then drape muslin or cheesecloth in between these little stands. But I would think this would be a problem bringing the food in every night. The way that people really preferred to dry their foods was in their ovens. They would put it in there and leave the door open a little bit, or they would use the heat from their ovens. Like this lady here, she's using a rotary slicer, putting the food on to trays, which go onto a rack, and then that rack was hanging above her stove. Here's another picture of the same method. They would also use dehydrators that would sit on top of their stove. They were metal boxes generally that had trays inside, and they would situate the trays so that the air would circulate through the box and up out the top. One tray would be pushed all the way to the back, and another would be pulled completely forward, and that way the air would circulate through the box. The picture on the right is a dehydrator. They sold these dehydrators back then. Another method they would use is they would put a pan of water on the stove, and then they would set another pan with the food inside of that one. It was like a double boiler type method. Another method they would use was just with air, no heat, just air. They would set an electric fan up in front of dehydrating boxes and blow the air through it. That's what the lady on the bottom picture is doing, and the top one is using a rotary slicer. You know, us ladies love our gadgets. They said this method was better than using heat. Of course, our dehydrators today use both the air and the heat. This lady had an Excalibur. I'm just kidding. It said this was at her country estate. They very often would spend their summers in the country and then the winters in the city. And they said that dehydrating the food was great because it was easier to transport. Sometime around the late 1800s, advances had been made in canning, so dehydrating fell out of favor. And they said they went pretty much a whole generation without dehydrating foods. It wasn't until World War I started that they realized the importance of having dehydrated foods. So that became a big thing once again. Another reason that they've kind of pulled away from dehydrated foods was because when it was done on a commercial basis, it was so inferior to what they could do at home. The store-bought dehydrated food was often moldy or infested with bugs because, you know, you saw the picture in the beginning where it was just laying out in the fields. The commercially dried foods were so bad that it just turned everybody off from the whole idea of drying foods. When the war started, they encouraged people to garden on vacant lots, pull together as communities, to form canning clubs, dehydrating clubs. They encouraged people to build dehydrators on large scales. This one was an outdoor dehydrator, and it could also double as a canner. The thing on the top was actually, it would hold water, and water bath canning could be done in that. And this last picture here is a community dehydrator. Well, everything old is new again. Once again, we went several generations without dehydrating foods, and once again, we've realized the value of it, and everybody has gone back to dehydrating. And by the way, I'm going to put some links in the description box to some of these books. One of them has a chart in it showing the drying times and temperatures and the blanching methods required for each of the foods. And it didn't take any longer to dehydrate food this way than it does the way we do it today. Everything would dry within, like, say, 3 to 6 hours. There's also a book that has a lot of recipes using dehydrated foods. I know that a lot of you would be interested in looking at that one. Also, if you need to rely on these methods, be sure to have on hand a thermometer that will read between, say, 100 and 150 degrees. They would lay a thermometer in the bottom of the tray and keep track of the temperature that way. So that's how they dehydrated food in the old days. Hope it helps.